Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about how to ensure your goods move smoothly at the start of 2022, where new rules for EU to GB imports are introduced. Brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade with Digital Trader Services. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Senior Content Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host for this afternoon. And thank you all for joining us today, several hundred of you on already. And indeed, with only a few weeks remaining now until importers need to complete declarations for all goods entering Britain, this is clearly a topic of great importance. But on to the next slide, please. As you'll see here, we've got a lot to cover today. First, we'll be hearing about the UK's approach to import controls for EU goods, before learning about the important role that the government's new Goods Vehicle Movement Service will play from 1st January. And we'll then have not one, but two Q&As. The first one focusing on technological solutions for keeping goods moving at the start of next year, before we open the floor more widely to your questions. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, you will have the opportunity to scan a QR code at different points of the webinar if you'd like to find out more information about the solutions Digital Trader Services is providing to traders for new declaration requirements. I'll also shortly be sharing a link in the chat room through which you can register your interest in Digital Trader Services. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see a little bit more about our speakers today. You will be sent a PDF of this slide pack though, so you can read more about their illustrious CVs later on. But to give a quick introduction, we'll first be hearing from Shankar Singham, the CEO of international trade law and economic policy consultancy Competare, and he'll be talking about the rules that are being introduced for imports on New Year's Day and beyond. We'll then hear from Paul Woodward, a trade and customs specialist at the Institute's Academy, and Paul will be guiding you through how to use the Goods Vehicle Movement Service. And we're also delighted to be joined by Frank Dunsmuir, Head of International Trade and Customs at Fujitsu, and Kieran Kelly, the CTO at supply chain tech firm Ubiquity, who will be joining us for the Q&As at the end. Next slide, please. Before handing over to Shankar, though, we're going to run a couple of quick polls to find out a little bit more about you, our audience. So if I quickly launch the first poll. So this is, how prepared are you for completing import declarations from 1 January 2022? While you are answering that poll, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions during the Q&A today, though please note we cannot guarantee that we will get to every single question in the allocated time. And a quick tip, if your questions are concise and easy for me to read, I'm far more likely to read them, so please keep them simple. Secondly, as already noted, you will receive access to today's slide pack and a recording of the webinar in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So please do try to listen in as carefully as you can to today's presentations. Right, so I'll give you a few more seconds to answer that poll. I'll close it now. Here are the results. So interesting, very interesting. So over 50% of you are quite prepared, and further 15% of you very prepared. So, well, a very high number of you are feeling prepared, but 17% not very prepared, 5% not at all prepared, 10% not sure. So hopefully this will be supportive to all of you, whatever stage of your preparations you're at. And if we move on to the next slide, so we're going to just ask another quick poll as well. So here we're asking, with rule changes set to be introduced from the start of next year, would you like Digital Trader Services experts to support you with any queries you may have around the rule changes and completing declarations for EU imports into Great Britain? Just while you are answering that poll, Shankar, really interesting response to the first one there. Over 60% of people on the line are feeling prepared in some way for the rule changes. Does that reflect kind of what you view the readiness of the business community to be for these rule changes?
Yeah, so thanks, Will. I think certainly it is evidence of improvement in this area, which I think is really important. But of course, it's December the 8th, and these changes are going to be in place in a few weeks, part of which period includes the Christmas holiday. So for 30% of people to feel that they're unprepared, I think that is significant. And I'd also raise the issue about, what are we prepared for? I mean, we're going to talk about in the presentation, quite a lot of changes that are coming up at sort of a series of different time periods. So, making sure you're fully prepared for all of those changes, not just, one aspect of the border operating model, I think will be very important.
Thanks, Shankar. And there's an article, I think, in the FD yesterday from a survey from the FSB, which had very different numbers in terms of the percentage of businesses which are ready. I think only a quarter of those businesses said that they were ready for rule changes. So it does depend on the business community you're asking. But I'll close that poll now, and if we move to the next slide. Is that poll closing? So I'm not quite sure why the slides aren't appearing there. Just bear with us 1 second. I mean, Shankar, just while we're looking at that issue of the slides coming up, it does depend on who you're talking to, doesn't it, in terms of business readiness? This is a very prepared audience because this is companies who are engaged with international trade, who are members of institutes or familiar with us. So it depends on your audience, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, and it may well be that the people who are sort of dutifully attending these kinds of seminars are the people who are more likely to be prepared, and there is probably a large community out there who aren't. Unfortunately, we're sort of all in this together, and as we'll describe, with certain aspects of the border operating model, it's going to be difficult. Unless everybody's prepared, you always get the possibility of one person who's not prepared holding up, causing a problem for others. So that is something we need to keep in mind.
Thanks, Shankar. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. Let's get on with the presentation. I'll get to your slide and over to you, Shankar.
Great. Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk fairly briefly about the border operating model, and there was obviously a first iteration of the border operating model as we, in the course of this year, as we prepare for January 1, 2022, and there has been quite recently a update on the border operating model, and that's what I'm really going to focus on today. So if we go to the next slide. So, as I said, in 2020, the UK published the UK border operating model. This was designed to talk about, what's going to happen, when the UK actually left the EU on January 1, 2021, and how that border was going to operate. The border operating model initially announced a timetable for phase controls. And on the 14th of September of this year, there was, as you know, a delay to some of those import controls. And then there was further clarification with respect to SPS and primarily agricultural and food products on the 18th of November. So what we've done is we're taking all of that and giving it to you in sort of one place so you can understand what is actually going to happen. If we go to the next slide. So what is the timeline for EU to GB import declarations? I'm going to talk a little bit about the customer side of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about GVMS and some of the other models that you use. So we have had in the course of this year this period of an easement period for standard goods where you can do entry into declarants records essentially, and then your supplementary declarations come into force. Are required within 175 days, and that's a rolling deadline from 1st of Jan. So the first declarations would then due on the 25th of June 2021. Now that period was extended as part of the changes to the border operating model to the end of the year, but that easement period ends on the 31st of December 2021. Go next. So what happens on the 1st of January 2022? The first thing is import declarations will now be required for all goods. So the stuff that's been required for, I mean, import declarations have been required for SPS goods and for control goods, that will now apply to all goods, and there won't be this deferred process. That does not mean there isn't a simplified frontier declaration to a supplementary declaration process being available, provided the trader has the requisite authorizations. But generally, if you don't have them, then you need to do frontier declarations. And that customs check process for standard goods begins on imports from the EU. The other thing that happens is that GVMS, which is the government's goods vehicle movement service, goes live for imports to GB. And that is important because of what I'm going to talk about in terms of the various models that you can use to get your goods into GB ports and airports. So we go to the next slide. Sorry, before we go to the next slide, if you go back one slide, that is a very important point. The 1st of July. So there's declarations, and there is process that's coming in on the 1st of January, which is phase 1. And then there's or rather phase 2, and then there's phase 3 of the border operating model, which comes in on the 1st of July. Now, on the customs side, what happens on the 1st of July is entry summary declarations, the safety and security declarations, will be required for goods entering GB from the EU. So you don't need to do them on the 1st of Jan, but you will have to do them on the 1st of July 2022. And now if we can go to the next slide. So the major thing that will happen outside of the sort of pure customs area is what's going to happen to sanitary and phytosanitary checks on GB EU imports. So, so on the 1st of January, all SPS movements into GB need to be pre-notified via the IPAFS system, which is the UK's agricultural control, effectively a system. It's the sort of analog to the European traces system, and those will have to be pre-notified. That IPAFS is running as of the 1st of January 2022 with a slightly more limited number of fields that need to be filled in, so it should not be enormously difficult for people to do the requisite pre-notifications for SPS movements. That will change as we go through this timeline, but at least initially it's a slightly more simplified version of IPAFS. And if we go to the next slide, sorry, the next edition. So what happens in phase 3, which is 1st of July 2022, at that point, you will have certification and physical identity checks for certain categories. And those categories are high-risk regulated animal byproducts, regulated plants and plant products, and meat products, and also high-risk food not of animal origin. On the 1st of September of 2022, you will get the same requirements and physical checks introduced for dairy products. And then on the 1st of November, certification and physical checks for remaining regulated products of animal origin, including composite products and fish products. The reason for the different time periods for different things is because different things carry different levels of risks for the UK supply chain and food chain. So 1st of July also, live animal checks begin to move from the point of destination to border control posts in stages as those facilities at border control posts become available. Now if we go to the next slide. So there will be 2 models that you can use. I mean, you'll no doubt be very familiar with the temporary storage model, which is the model that is currently available. The temporary storage model, businesses provide the safety and security information before the goods board the ferry, but customs formalities can occur while the goods are temporarily stored after arriving in a GB port, and they can be stored for 90 days. So that's one model. The other model is new, and I think it really will repay some attention, partly because not all points of entry into the UK will have storage facilities that will be available. So pre-lodgement also prioritizes flow. It's a model that is designed to ensure that goods flow from the EU into GB. So what happens with pre-lodgement is the importers you'll complete your declarations before the goods leave the EU. And customs clearance takes place while the goods are on the ship, if they're going ro-ro, or while they're in transit. So this enables companies to move goods quickly. It's going to be, I think, quite important for high priority items, food, medicines, perishable goods, that kind of thing. And obviously it's important depending on where it is that you're bringing your products into. And it will be supported, pre-lodgement will be supported by that new goods vehicle movement service, the GVMS system that is being designed, that will be implemented on January 1. So if we go to the next slide. So I'll very quickly introduce GVMS and then we'll have a more detailed discussion about it. It's designed to enable faster clearance of vehicles at ports. It's really designed because of the sort of uniqueness of the goods that flow in from the EU into GB. Very high use of ro-ro, very high use of vehicles bringing those goods in, where you absolutely want to make sure that there isn't a blockage at the port or at the relevant facility. And GVMS enables hauliers, carriers, and port operators to use that single GMR, that goods movement reference number, for a vehicle that can be processed on arrival. If you do your GVMS entry and you've done your pre-lodged declaration and you get your MRNs then give you a GMR. It is the GMR that allows you to proceed through the port, and it links. And GVMS will do this. It links all the MRNs on a container in a shipment to a single GMR that is connected to the truck or trailer license plate. And the haulier needs to have the GMR, as I said, to board any ferry. For example, if you're talking about ro-ro heading to GB from the EU, and if you don't have a GMR, you won't be able to go through the terminal. So if you are going to use pre-lodgement, it is incredibly important that you familiarize yourselves immediately with GVMS, with this process, exactly how all these different systems interconnect. If you're trading in SPS goods, then what are the minimum requirements to do that pre-lodged IPAFS entry? You need to think about all these things if you're going to use that model, because the model works very well if you do everything right. But if you don't, then you could experience problems. Now, some ports do temporary storage. Some ports will be doing pre-lodged pre-lodgement. There are hybrid models. There are some places that will do both. There are potentially bespoke arrangements for traders, but you need to be talking to HMRC if you're interested in using some sort of bespoke arrangement. So if we go to the next slide, I think I'm handing back over to Will.
Thanks, Shankar. Really great introduction to all that's going on starting next year. I'm just going to launch that next poll now. Hopefully this one won't cause any glitches, but this one's asking, do you know whether your haulier has registered to use GVMS or not? Obviously a very key question. I mean, Shankar, you were talking through the timelines for the border operating model earlier. There's obviously been a few changes to it throughout the last year. Do you expect there to be any further changes to those timelines in the coming months?
Yeah, that's the $64 million question, isn't it? I don't expect there to be major changes to this now. I think we are just weeks away. If there's any sort of change, I think it might be related to the way that the IPAFs or the way that GVMS might operate. What I don't think there will be a change to is the requirement for frontier declarations. It's been quite a long time, and if you think about the UK border, we essentially have a border where anyone can bring pretty much anything in. There's no entry summary declaration, there's no safety and security declaration, there's EIDR to get the product into GB. There may or may not be a supplementary declaration done properly after the event. There's a limit to how long you can sort of sustain a country with that kind of border arrangement. So I don't expect that will change. There may be some tinkering around the edges to make it slightly easier for traders, but the frontier declaration I don't think is going to change.
Ultimately, you have to come in at some point, so yeah, we can't push it off forever. And just quickly before we move on to the next part, you mentioned the pre-lodgement and the temporary storage models. What are the pros and cons to either of those? Kind of why should one go for one model over the other?
Well, I think temporary storage, worked with a certain volume of trade. One thing that's going to happen, obviously, the sheer volume of trade coming from EU to GB, the sheer volume of declarations that are required means that there is going to be significant pressure on the frontier, and that is why the pre-lodgement option was developed by HMRC. It was designed to ensure that we did get flow, we did prioritize flow in this process. So you took the pressure off the frontier, and I think anything that takes the pressure off the frontier. So if you're a trader who's doing a significant volume of business between the EU and GB, I think you're going to want to do something that takes that, that alleviates the pressure on the frontier. That's going to be a real priority for you. And I think that is why I would, strongly counsel people to look at pre-lodgement as the easiest option. Ultimately, I mean, you may have to do some things initially that you would probably not have to do at the moment. In other words, you've got to do your customs declarations, before the goods move. But I think it's worth. I think it is worth doing because what you don't want is January 1 your goods held up somewhere in a port.
And this is a really interesting poll result following that very topic. So 67% of you do not yet know whether your haulier has registered to use GVMS, and a third of you do. But this is something we're hearing quite a lot, and it therefore makes the next part of this presentation, if I can bring Paul Woodward on, really important. So Paul, are you there? And can you see your slide just to double check that?
Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm here, Will, and yeah, I can see the slides. That's great. So I suppose, thank you for that, Will. I suppose another thing, just before we move on, fair enough to Shanker's comments there. It's about the management of carriers, freight forwarders, fast parcel operators, traders are using now in our new status outside of the EU. There's more management needed there. Do they have the right controls in place? Have they got registrations? What's the process they're following? Because you can get breakdown if a haulier isn't doing what's expected. That can lead to delays and impacts within the supply chain and kind of doesn't facilitate the pre-lodgement model. So having those key requirements in place is really key. Just a final comment just on that last poll, if that was okay. So yeah, we're now going to look at using the goods vehicle movement service, so GVMS. So can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so here we're basically got a slide here taking us through the imports from the EU. So we know, since the start of January this year, we've had to have safety, security, GVMS to export goods from Great Britain or move them over to Northern Ireland. That's been what the main crux of getting used to was at the start of this year. But now with the latest developments on the border operating model and the changes from the 1st of January next year, this will also be relevant for imports from the EU. We know safety and security declarations will become later on the 1st of July next year, as Shankar rightly said in the timeline, but we will have the requirement there to do GVMS as part of this pre-lodgement. So being able to, for the UK government to risk assess this process and be able to look at your goods which are moving in, to have that pre-clearance done so there's no more further delays within the supply chain. Everything's taken care of before the goods land, and at that point then the decision comes if they're free to move on, or if there's an inspection, whether it's physical or documentation, that would need to be done. So in these steps, we're looking at first, the GB importer is going to obviously raise the invoice. There's export declaration will be raised in the EU by the EU exporter. And this will be done by them unless selling on ex-works terms. And this is where Incoterms become so important. Looking at your Incoterms, you've got these are all surrounding risk, responsibility and cost. Ex-works doesn't have to necessarily include the supplier completing the export declaration. So in this state from the EU, so maybe FCA terms are a lot better for you. So that declaration would need to be raised. That is then lodged at the EU port of exit. This then is accompanied with that GVMS entry to facilitate that. And then the GB import declaration is logged, and either you can then complete that entry, as we said, for full frontier, or through that simplified CFSP process if you are approved. And a lot of fast parcel operators are approved, freight forwarders, customs brokers, which can facilitate traders within this area. Additional steps that we would need to look at here is creating the GB goods movement reference. Later on, obviously, there's going to be the need for the safety and security declarations. And then on arrival in Great Britain, go to the border control post. Now, this is one of the key concerns at the moment. So obviously, if they're raising the GMR, we have that. How's then the carrier, the person in control of the goods, the truck driver, how's he going to know whether he's got to go to a border control post for an inspection, or if he can happily go along his journey and deliver his goods to his recipients? This is something that carriers will have to think about. How's that communication dialogue going to be managed so there isn't any slowdown of the international trade movement? Next slide, please. Also, as Shankar has rightly pointed out, we've got to look at sanitary and phytosanitary goods, also known as SPS. And this is coming in through further elements as well. We've seen on the timeline previously that obviously there is requirements for those to be ready. And this is from July. So as we know at the moment, from the 1st of January, you'll be doing an IPAS entry, and that will get your goods into the country. Another condition on top of your other requirements to get the goods into GB. When you've raised that export declaration again, there will be a need from the 1st of July to have that export health certificate if it's deemed required for the products you are moving. Remember, there was further requirements within those delayed timelines, and that's up to November at the end of next year. So understanding where you are as part of that stage is going to be critical for how businesses need to proceed with their movements. Obviously, we have the same process there. The declaration is lodged at the EU exit port, GB import declarations lodged either by Full Frontier or CFSP, and also that need to create an IPAS entry. And it is also really worth taking into account understanding from the border operating model what timelines you've got. So it may be a day for ro-ro activities if it's coming in by air. Yeah, that can be due 30 minutes before it lands. So there is different time frames there, which are all stipulated within the border operating model, which you should be aware of. And then looking at it from a GVMS perspective, those additional steps again, GB GMR to be created, that risk assessment en route, clearance en route, and potentially if it is SPS goods, it will be asked to go to that border control post to have full inspection done of documentation, the livestock, the products which could be there, to make sure they're all matching up. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned already, it is really important to be doing business reviews on your Incoterms right from the start. These are all about, as I've said before, it's a risk, it's a cost, and it's responsibility. Based on the Incoterms that you could use, it would either give the seller a lot of costs or minimal costs, or they could be passed on to the buyer. Again, we can see here on the right-hand side the 11 Incoterms, X works, free carrier, all going down to the D terms, which is delivered at place and loaded, and delivered duty paid, the famous online term as I refer to it as. So these are all required to be matched on your commercial invoice as in the declaration. Also remember that these should be the same terms which are stated contractually, else customs can pull you up on that. It will also define to customs who the exporter and the importer is on these goods, especially if you were to use delivered duty paid terms. You would need to be the exporter and the importer, which could need fiscal representation, VAT registrations, and a way to pay duties and taxes and bring those goods into the country. So again, you could be responsible for a lot of customs formalities, especially when we're looking at control goods, phytosanitary goods, SPS goods. These could all have extra requirements that you would need to make sure you adhere to. And it really just bear in mind, Incoterms do determine who is responsible for arranging that transport. Where does it sit? Where do the costs lie? Who's paying what within that international trade movement? So it is worth an in-depth review on that and making sure you have linkages from purchase, sales order, shipping, commercial invoice to the export declaration as well. Having that consistency and alignment throughout is critical. Next slide, please. And finally, yeah, we're going to look at the responsibility. So do bear in mind that the importer is legally responsible for the accuracy of the information submitted in an import declaration. Look at the types of representation you have with your third parties, your freight forwarders, your customs brokers, because based on that, there could be shared responsibility, or you yourself could be fully liable. May hire a customs agent or freight forwarder. These can submit these declarations on your behalf. Fast parcel operator mechanisms with memorandum of understanding if they are of a low value. And on submission, the declaration movement reference number will need to be generated. So looking at the movement reference number, this needs to be provided to the haulier carrying the goods from EU to GB. They will then generate that goods movement reference within the GVMS system. Without this, you're not going to be able to board ferry crossings, road transport. Next slide, please. And back to you now, Will. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. And just quickly, I'll keep you for 1 second. So we've had a few questions asking around one of the slides,
Sure.
so where it says the invoice is raised and then the declarations are submitted. So is that in that process, as the invoice is raised, because that then has the information to provide to an intermediary, like a customs agent, to then do the declaration? Is that what's meant there?
Yeah, sure it is. Yeah. Sometimes you would, and again, it's based on those lovely Incoterms as well, Will. If you're responsible for the export, you could see yourself having to create the commercial invoice with the values on there, description of goods, values, other attributes as well, commodity codes, country of origin, and then that is going to, remember that the commercial invoice creates 90% of the information needed for a customs declaration. So that's your driving document, which then if you pass on to a broker would facilitate them in being able to do that on your behalf.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for clearing that up. Hope that's helped everyone. Anyway, time is of the essence. So thanks, Paul, once again for the presentation. And it's now my delight to welcome back Frank and Kieran. We're going to ask a few questions around the technological solutions for keeping goods moving in 2022. And where better to start off than with GVMS. We had a question from Dharmesh who asked, basically saying, will GVMS be ready for 1st January? And a follow-up question to that may be, is the haulier community ready for it? Because it seems to say some of our traders don't know if they are or not. So I'll put that to you first, Frank. What do you think? Is GVMS going to be ready, and are hauliers ready for it?
Hi, Will, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, it's a good question. I think we can say with confidence GVMS will be ready. It's been running live for trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland for most of this year, and it will be switched on and operational from January the 1st for movement from Great Britain across the straits into EU and into Republic of Ireland as well. And as you've heard from Paul, it's a critical system. If we don't get this right, the vehicle won't get into the port, it won't be able to board the ferry, it'll be turned away at that particular point. So even though the system's there, evidence at the moment is hauliers have not signed up en masse to the system. I haven't seen the latest figures in the last couple of weeks, but we were down in the low numbers, sub 1,000 hauliers recently. So that needs more stimulus in order to get the hauliers registered onto the GVMS system. And judging from the poll, I'd encourage the participants in today's poll to get hold of their particular carriers and ask the question of them, are they ready for GVMS? For those of you that are interested in the GVMS product, you can actually use your government gateway ID to register and to look at the GVMS system for yourself online if you're interested in looking at what it actually looks like.
Thanks, Frank. And just on the topic of declarations, so obviously traders are having to get used to a whole new set of rules, but there's also the systems interfaces for submitting the declarations themselves, particularly of self-filing. And could you give a quick overview of what those systems are, and maybe are there any technological solutions to help traders adjust to these new rules?
Yeah, so in terms of creating declarations, it depends on the products you're moving. So depending on what sort of products you're moving will be a range of different requirements and different systems that you'll need to update. So in simple terms, for commodities that are not subject to controls or licenses, you'll at least have to create a declaration on the CDS system or Chief. You'll have to at some point enter declarations on ICS for the entry and safety security declarations, and now we know we'll have to do GVMS records as well, and that's for the UK side. And then depending on the product, you may need excise records raised on the ECMS system. You might be using transit for NCTS, you might be transporting food products, so you need IPAFs, etc. So the numbers quickly start to grow depending on the type of products you're moving. And part of the challenge we have there is pretty much the same data set, or there's an awful lot of repeat data. So you'll be putting things like vehicle registration numbers and departure dates and commodity codes into those systems multiple times, or into multiple systems. So ideally we want something that joins that up. The DTS service does do that. It looks at joining up one set of data to create those entries into those different systems, and it starts with the standard goods at the moment, and we'll start to build up that portfolio across other goods, so that you're entering your goods data and your journey data once, and that data will go into the right government systems as required by that type of commodity. And I think that's one of the issues we've heard from the trading and transport communities over the last year, is the administrative overheads are quite high in terms of time and effort to key this information in.
Thanks, Frank. It'd be great to know. I'll just say hello to Kieran as well. So Kieran, you're very much at the cutting edge of this. You've got a vast experience in supply chain technology. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you're involved in, but also how some of the more advanced technologies like blockchain and distributed ledger technology can be used to support traders in these coming periods of weeks and months.
Thanks, Will, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel today. So DLT is already operating in supply chains. We can start to see the benefits to help create that foundation of a connected community, and essentially that becomes in itself an ecosystem of trust. It's already supporting financial trade and ensuring digital provenance. And when you see global organizations like Maersk reporting the benefits of the DLT technology and how it can help utilize a single version of the truth, as Frank referred to earlier, data is being entered into multiple systems. The DLT, whilst not a complete panacea, is there to help establish trust, to help the flow and create a single version of trust, and actually help shape the process for the faster sharing of information, validation of data, and actually building on this connected ecosystem of trust that we see through trade, through manufacturing, through transport, through shipping, through customs, and through logistics. And we believe that it can remove risk. It can also expedite and remove the burdens of dual administration to work on one single version of the truth.
Really interesting. Again, there's another interesting article on VFT. I don't work for them, I promise, talking about smart borders and the government's work there. I think it's in yesterday, so it's well worth a read. There's a lot going on in this space. Just one more question for you, Kieran, and bringing it back to businesses. Obviously, there's a lot of additional phytosanitary checks which are coming in as well. What solutions will there be for companies who are having to compete or comply with these new checks and requirements as well?
I think what we're working towards is a shared community where we're using a smarter freight solution where we can start to create an open platform and utilize the data that already exists within the system to validate that, to connect manufacturing with haulage, with customs agent, with shipping agents, to be able to provide that fast movement, the reduction, as Frank said, and as Shankar eloquently put, to remove that overhead and that burden. And as we start to see smarter freight, smarter logistics integrate with smarter customs, we can start to see how that platform can actually start to develop and enhance trade and support frictionless trade across the GB and EU.
Thanks, Kieran. That's really interesting. Again, I suppose there's a watch this space element to it, but at the same time, technologies are live now at the moment, ready to use for companies, or is it still kind of coming through? I think we may have lost Kieran, but let's move on to the next part anyway. So, as I said, Digital Trader Services is there to help companies, and we're going to go into the last Q&A now. And this is going to ask you. So basically, we've had lots of questions come in advance of the webinar. So if we don't get to your questions in the next few minutes, here's your opportunity to opt in or to say you'd like to be contacted by one of Digital Trader Services experts for a free 10 to 15 minute consultation regarding your query. But we'll try to get to a few questions now. So let's start with one for Paul, if I can bring you back, Paul. This is one from Stuart, who's asking around how GVMS will work with customs freight simplified procedures or entry and declarants records. So we haven't covered special procedures in much detail today. Could you just give a quick overview of these procedures and how they may interact with GVMS?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we haven't touched on them today. And I'd like to say that customs special procedures are not mandatory. They're optional for a business, but they do have great benefits. So the ones that, can be used is one would be customs warehousing. This is where, remember that when it's a special procedure, your goods are not in free circulation. You wouldn't have paid those duties and taxes. So that is deferred until you decide what you want to do with the goods. Customs warehousing, you can bring finished products not in free circulation, stored in a customs warehouse without payment of customs duty, excise duty and import VAT until you release them from there and decide what you want to do with them. Potential that customs duty could be never paid if it's then re-exported back outside of Great Britain. Another one is inward processing relief, now known as inward processing, and this is payment of duties and import VAT is suspended on goods while processing is taking place. If you're a manufacturer, you're bringing components in at a duty rate and levy, you can bring them into a suspended custom state, not paying your duties and taxes until they're made into a finished product and you decide what to do. Outward processing is primarily, again, duty suspension, allowing the temporary export of goods for process repair. So again, could be beneficial based on your business operations. Temporary admission, well, this is, this allows to authorize you to import goods, total or partially duty relief, because they go to a specific end use, like propulsion engine that's going to be manufactured and put into a cruise ship. Yeah, it's got that end use, a specific authorized use. Also, it's always really worthwhile to bearing in mind that not all these need comprehensive customs guarantees. There are waivers out there with HMRC at the moment, where you can get a reduced customs guarantee rate, or you could be waived entirely from having that benefit put in place. And these are all going to be defined by that customs procedure code. You're going to need GVMS, of course, but with the customs procedure code, that's telling customs what regime you're entering it into. Are we going to pay duties now? Is it going into that suspended state and operating under that model?
Thanks, Paul. And we've done quite a few webinars this year on customs special procedures, so it's definitely if you're interested, we can send you the links to those. There's absolutely loads we've done on those. Next question is from Helen, and I'll put this one to Shankar if Shankar's still with us. So this question is regarding origin statements and supplier declarations. This is one we touched on our last webinar with DTS, but Shankar, could you give a recap in terms of what are the evidential requirements traders need to be providing to be claiming preferential origin, and what are the easements around these, and what's going on with those?
Yeah, so I mean, this is going to be quite a difficult area, I think, for people. There are two aspects to origin. One is related to the sort of SPS and those kinds of requirements, which are what you'd ordinarily put into IPAS. The fields for origin are not going to be, you don't have to fill in all of this information from January 1. So you've got a little bit of a break there. But the bigger problem is satisfying rules of origin for the trade agreement. So as I think people are gradually discovering, the rules of origin of the EU-UK TCA are, by general trade agreement standards, somewhat restrictive, which means that just because your goods are in free circulation in the EU and they then move into GB does not mean that they automatically satisfy the trade agreement's rules of origin. So that will depend on the specific provisions of the chapter on rules of origin. It will depend on things like local content. It will depend on a range of other things. So now, in order to make life a little bit easier for traders, modern trade agreements, and the EU UK TCA is one of them in this respect, provide that you don't just have, you're not required to do a declaration of origin. You can actually use importer's knowledge, but importer's knowledge doesn't mean you can simply say that you believe it's satisfying origin. You now need these origin statements, and you need to therefore go to your exporter. You know, if you're the importer in GB, you need to go to your exporter and you need to get these origin statements that essentially give evidence that you're in fact satisfying the rule of origin of the agreement. And the rule of origin of the agreement in the agreement differs from product to product. So you need to know what your product is, you need to know what the rule of origin specifically is, and then you need to provide that evidence and get that evidence from your exporter so that you can satisfy this requirement. I suspect this is going to be a big issue for people because if you don't satisfy origin, then notwithstanding the fact that the trade agreement is zero tariffs and zero quotas, you will end up paying as an importer, depending on the Incoterms that Paul talked about, you will end up paying the UK's global tariff rate, whatever that is, the UK's WTO rate to rest of world. So it can be, especially for certain products, this can be big numbers. This can be big percentage differences between the zero tariff of the trade agreement and potentially much higher tariffs under the UK's global tariff schedule.
Will, just a quick question, if I may come in on Shankar there. We do have an easement which is ending on that importer's knowledge, and that ends on the 1st of January next year, where it will be mandatory for any traders importing to have those declaration statements of origin on hand to prove. At the moment, you can make importer's knowledge statements without having to verify. that easement ends as of the 1st of January and can create extra challenges for traders as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, importers' knowledge is designed to improve the flow of trade, but as Paul said, it doesn't mean you can just say it. It doesn't mean you can just announce that you satisfy the rules of origin. And I think people may have gotten sort of lulled into a false sense of security here. But it comes back to the same point that Paul actually made earlier on, which is we're all in this together. You're going to have to start talking to your haulier. You're going to have to start talking to your exporter. You're going to have to determine what those Incoterms are. There's a lot of things that traders, who've been trading and happily trading within the European Union never had to think about, which you're now going to have to think about and think about it quite fast.
Thanks both. I mean, as noted, we did do a webinar on this a couple of weeks back, which is the recording of which is on the Digital Trader Services website. So for more information about Origin and your requirements there, please do check that out. We're running slightly over, but I'll do a couple more questions just because we've had so many come through. This is one for Frank from Sam, who said, how is Digital Trader Services different to other customs declaration software programs?
Thank you for the question. It's very different. It's a unique offering in the market today, and it was designed around market research of what are the problems and challenges that are being introduced with the new customs and legislation requirements for trade with the EU. And they really shone out as a lack of awareness of what to do. What is it I need to do? What processes do I need to follow? Access to skills. So do I have the skills in-house to manage the processes in-house? Even if I'm using an intermediary, I still need some awareness and knowledge in-house. And then ways to keep the cost and administration processes down. As we've talked earlier about the multiple data entry points, etc. So in order to address those points, DTS is an all-encompassing service. It's got advisory, consulting, and general support in the package. And at the heart of it is a software product, a unique software product that simply takes commercial invoice information, and once you've input that commercial invoice information, the DTS platform enriches it with the codes and secret information that Chief and CDS will need to create a declaration. So the beauty of this is you don't need to be a customs expert to use DTS to create a declaration. If there are any errors or problems with that, we will deal with those for you. So again, you don't need to see those complex errors and processes. And as I mentioned before, it will update the government systems as required, so you don't need to do multiple data entry points. So it's pretty unique in the way it sits and is positioned in the market.
Thanks, Frank. I'll do one last question. It's a biggie. It's from Helena, and this will be interesting to get everyone's view on, but I'll start with Shankar. So Helena's asked, what disruption can we actually expect on 1st January, and what can we do to mitigate it?
That's another $64 million question. Well, of course, we don't know. Now, I think the UK government has done everything in its power to ensure that the new systems like GVMS and IPAF certainly are implemented in such a way as to cause minimal difficulties for traders. So the declarations will be required, and if people don't do those, there will be, there could be a problem. But I think the history has been that lots of easements don't necessarily get trade ready for what's going to come. People have we're all human beings. Human beings. If you tell someone you've got another 2 weeks to do your exam, you're going to down tools and do your exam and have an exam crisis, an essay crisis, the day before the exam is due. So I think it's therefore unlikely that the UK will push this out again. They pushed out many times. So I think that it is, in terms of the mitigation part of the question, which is I think the important one, as I said before, and as Paul said, really have those conversations with your community. You are importing, you've got an exporter, you've got a carrier, you've got a haulier, there's a lot of people involved in the process, and you need to make sure that you manage your systems and manage those parts of your supply chain as well as you possibly can. And that is a good business practice anyway. I mean, regardless of the customer stuff, I mean, that is what you should be doing anyway. That's the way you're going to become better at international trade, and that's what I think is going to be required. And it's going to be, you know, if you look back at what happened on January 1 of 2021 for GB2 EU, it was pretty tough for a few weeks, maybe a month or two, but people got used to it, and it worked out. So I think we'll get through this. Just to be a little bit positive. I think we will get through this, but it does require everyone that's involved, and it isn't just the government. It is critically traders as well, to sort of join hands and do the necessary to make sure that the trade does flow.
Paul, do you have anything to add to that? And then we'll finish off.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just echo everything that Shanker said. They're all right. All those aspects there. It is your business. You have to own it. You have to speak to all parties concerned, work with them, effectively communicate, building roles and responsibilities, SOPs, SLAs with them so you know where you stand and what you need to do. Other things, the UK government's done as much as they can. Other external factors, lack of drivers, lack of transport, you know, Suez Canal, empty containers in the wrong part of the world, all things outside of anybody's control, even the UK government's, yeah? Even EU are struggling with this. They are things which could come. And like we said, probably imagine it's going to be exactly like January last year. Then after a month or two, people get used to the changes and then they deliver that and then it smooths its way through. I think the big challenge we had initially was people didn't do GVMS. That means they got turned away. That means it built blockades. That's why the government gave £50,000 worth of fines in the first month when it all kicked off. So again, having your processes correct doesn't mean you're going to be turned away. And then you don't create a bottle chain and a bottleneck where there's delays at ports. So it's just getting your infrastructure supply chain right, and echo what Shanker said.
Thank you both. And I should say to everyone, but we will be doing a webinar in the second week, I think, of January, basically addressing any issues which are going to come up in the first couple of weeks as everyone adjusts to these new rules. I think it'll be a really helpful webinar, hopefully, and it'll be much more of a Q&A format as well. So do keep your eyes peeled for that one. But at this point, I'm going to have to say we've run out of time. This was supposed to be 45 minutes, so we've run slightly over, in fact. But thank you, everyone, for all the questions. We've had absolutely loads of questions, so thank you for sending them in, and we'll look at what we can do with those afterwards. Well, thank you once again to Frank, Shanker, Paul, Kieran, all for joining us today. It's been a very information-packed webinar once again. We hope you found that useful. You will get access to a recording and the slides from today's webinar that will come over the next day or so. But for now, thank you for joining. If I don't speak to you before, have a great Christmas and Happy New Year. But bye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, William.